Hey, good to see everybody. Yeah, I'm Tom. I'm a Python developer and a Django user, and I am a security consultant for SafeStack.io. And today I'm wearing my developer hat. I am going to be talking about Django, which is a thing that I have been using for very close to 10 years now. I realized that actually I must have got on the bandwagon not long after it started. I got on early 2006. And I'm here today to finally tell you about how the one true way of doing Django deployments doesn't actually exist. If you didn't see the description for my talk, I don't actually mind if you leave now because you're disappointed that there's not actually a one true way of doing it, so false advertising and all that sort of thing. This has always come as a bit of a shock because in so many other ways, Django treats me really, really well. Django is an absolute joy for development. Let's look at some of the great things Django does for you when you first get started in web development, when you're first trying to get something built. First up, obviously, the Django documentation is the single best piece of technical documentation of any open source project on the planet. Does anyone disagree with that? Russ is looking around. Nope. I love the Django documentation. The instantly available built-in web server that Django gives you, which auto-reloads on code changes. It serves static files seamlessly, and with one or two extra lines of code, it'll automatically serve all of the uploaded media files as well. You basically get to kickstart your development with almost no overhead. You don't need a web server because they've got a built-in web server. You don't need a database because it comes with SQLite 3 built in. Hell, it's even got a built-in caching framework, right? The locmem framework. You don't need to get mem-cached. You don't need any of that stuff. The debug mode is just amazing, right? You've got model verification. You've got the fantastic debug messages on 404 errors, which give you all of the URL stuff. And you've got the 500 errors with a full traceback, so you can go all the way down and even look at the local variables that were in the function that threw the exception, that threw the thing. It's just awesome. It's great. And then it's time you finished your project, and the training wheels kind of fall off a little bit. You suddenly find that in the real world, getting a Django website out in the open into public is actually a lot more complicated. You'd better not be using SQLite 3 anymore. You know, actually I say that, but there's valid reasons for doing that sometimes, but you probably weren't expecting to. You better have already sorted out all your logging infrastructure. You better be using the Python logging library and have done that weird dictionary configuration thing in the settings file, which, now that I mention it, while we're just drawing the contrast, the logging documentation in Python is not the single best piece of technical documentation on the planet. Hands up who disagrees with me. You have to have written your own 404 or 500 error messages. If you've forgotten that, then you'll have a bad time. Oh, you better have configured your allowed hosts variable, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. Who's been hit by the surprise 400 Look at that. Yep. It gets everybody. You better have gotten a WSGI server to run your Django code because you can't use the dev server anymore. Oh, and you actually still need a regular web server to put in front of it in the first place. And of course, hopefully you've got your database cache server and AMQP server all good and all of your infrastructure all set up all nicely because all of that's trivial, right? And then you've actually got to deploy it. You've actually got to get it to where it's going. All of that was just what happens when debug turns off. So what do I mean when I'm talking about deployment today? Basically what I mean is taking a repository of your code in a certain state and performing whatever steps you need to get it running on the server somewhere. It's the thing that you do when you've finished updating your repository and before seeing it live on the web server. Where did you put your code? How did you put it there? Where are all of its dependencies and how did they get there? And how is the code actually being run? Like what is actually running the Python stuff that you wrote that you want to turn into a website of some kind? This is from the Zen of Python. I assume everyone here is familiar with that. If you bring up a Python interpreter, you go import this, and you get like a set of principles that are basically my favorite thing about Python. Like the philosophy behind that stuff is one of the things that makes me choose Python for all of my projects. And this is why I'm driven to talk about this today, because Django itself gives you the one obvious way to do it in so many different areas, except when it comes to deployment. you're spoiled for choice to the degree that you're bound to get destroyed by decision fatigue. I guess it's actually fair to say that it couldn't have been any other way very easily. The world is complicated, and the freedom to choose needed to be in the hands of the people doing the deployment. In the developer environment, there's a lot of choices that could be made for you, but in deployment, your circumstances are always so different. On the other hand, they were successful in dropping the barrier to development to next to zero. I wonder if in the future we can get to the same place with Django deployments. So before we dig in, what are actually the desirable properties of a Django deployment, of any deployment in general, but obviously we're talking about Django today? In a perfect world, there would be just some kind of push-button deployment that would do all the work. So you want it to be as automatic as feasible. You want it to be push your button, and it runs some scripts, it does some stuff, it deploys some packages, and you have a deployment. A deployment's got to be predictable and repeatable. If you do the same deployment twice, or you haven't changed the repository in the meantime, you need to get exactly the same result. And I want to really emphasize this. Your deployment should never, ever be surprising. You don't want to have to run it twice and go, oh, I wonder why there's a different library installed by pip this time than last time. You don't want that to happen. That's why there's like a cliche surprising development and not a cliche surprising deployment. And I apologize, that was a terrible joke and I shouldn't have tried it. It would be nice if you could roll back your deployment if you screwed it up. If something went wrong, it didn't deploy correctly, a bug that your integration tests didn't pick up or something, it would be really nice to not be a challenge to quickly get the old code back if you need to. This one's a little bit of my own opinion. You really want to minimize third-party infrastructure development. Let's say you're in a hurry to update because of some kind of bug or issue or a compromise or something where it's like, oh, I need to get this update out there really quickly, but you can't because the Python package index is down for maintenance or GitHub is down for maintenance or some other piece of third-party infrastructure that you rely on is down for maintenance or just down. Maybe the reason it's down is why you need to do a deployment. That would be unfortunate. A deployment shouldn't clobber your settings, like your database key or your secret key or any of those environment-specific settings that might change from your staging to your production environment. Doing a deployment shouldn't clobber those because you want to be able to set those smoothly and conveniently between deployments. You might need to change a setting, and you don't want to necessarily go through a whole deployment process depending on how convoluted it is. And finally, it would be really nice if you could do continuous deployment or continuous integration that leads to deployment. That's out of scope for this talk. I'm not really going into that. But if your deployment is these other things, if it's reasonably automatic, if it's predictable, if you've gotten through most of the rest of this stuff, then it's really usually just a short jump to get to a continuous deployment as well. So what I'm going to try, I don't have the answers for you here today, but I want to give you some tips in trying to get there. I want to give you some advice from my 9.5 years of experience where I have come up with at least half again as many ways of deploying Django projects as actually written Django projects. And so I need to actually just warn you ahead of time that some of this content may include opinion. Excuse me for a second. It might surprise you that some important architectural decisions that you might make when you're designing your system or doing a Django deployment, or designing your deployment, sorry, don't actually make a lot of difference to your deployment mechanism. So some choices that don't matter, what database backend you're actually using. That's one of those decisions which might be a big decision and it might have a lot of opinion and you might spend a lot of time agonizing between Postgres and MySQL. Use Postgres. Sorry, that was Freudian slip or something. But it doesn't make a difference to your deployment. It's one of those big decisions that actually isn't interesting. If you're using a WHISky application server, did I say that correctly? WHISky, is that how we're going to pronounce it today? Cool, okay. The decision between using Green Unicorn or ModWhisky. Is that how we're going to pronounce that today? Cool. That doesn't really make a lot of difference. You know, they have different designs a little bit, but they do the same job. And so making that choice actually isn't really that big of a deal. Your web server, like Apache versus an Nginx, doesn't make a difference which one you use. They're both very good, mature web servers. The only part of that decision that does make a difference is if you're going to use ModWSGI, where that informs some of the other decisions that you'll end up making. The choices that do matter when you're doing a Django deployment, whether you're going to run it on platform as a service or you're going to do it on your own infrastructure, like that's a major first-off decision. Are you just going to deploy it to Heroku or something like that? Whether you have decided to use as your application code platform ModWSGI, no, ModWhisky, I'll practice that, ModWhisky, or using a dedicated Whiskey application server like Green Unicorn or uWhisky. This is the problem. I read these terms. I don't say them out loud much. How you're actually going to get your files there obviously makes a big difference. Are you using libraries from the Python package index, or are you going pure with distribution libraries or something like that? That makes a big difference to your deployment. Are you going to put them all in a virtualenv, or are you just going to pip install them system-wide? How will you configure your environment local settings? So these are the decisions that make a bigger difference to how you're actually going to do your building. And for most of these decisions, there aren't any clear universal winners. There are trade-offs, and there's pros and cons, and there's consequences to each. So I can't make these decisions for you, but what I'm hoping I can do is give you some context and tools to help you make the right decision for your project and your environment. And it really is different for each person. One of the things I did in the lead up to this talk is I sent out an email to a couple mailing lists saying, hey, tell me how you're doing your deployments. How are you handling each of these decisions? And every response I got, and I got maybe 10 from different organizations, every single one had a completely different answer for each thing. So that doesn't mean any of them are necessarily doing it wrong, but it means that this is a valuable conversation because everyone's kind of finding their own way. Before we dig into some of these specific choices, who is familiar with the 12-factor app manifesto? Cool, a pretty decent number of you. That's neat. The 12-factor app manifesto, can someone just shout out what the actual website is? But if you just
12factor.net.
Cool. And just Googling 12-factor, it'll immediately come up. Oh, yes, 12factor.net. Yep. The 12-factor app manifesto is a set of guidelines published by, I think, a bunch of people from Heroku, and maybe some others as well, on what they think the best practices are for modern web development. It's pretty compulsory reading. Everyone who didn't put their hands up, I do recommend that you Google it and you go through all 12. It's pretty useful stuff. My opinion on the 12-factor app manifesto is that every single factor is a very good idea. And if you let it guide your architectural decisions, you're going to be in pretty good shape. You're going to be in reasonably good shape for the future, and it solves some useful things. But don't feel bad if some of the factors are harder for you to attain than others. If because of your infrastructure, like environment variables aren't the right place to put your local settings. I think it's best if your app trends towards 12-factor, and if you can make some of those calls easily, then you're not making the wrong call. But don't treat it like a set of commandments that you end up following. So even the simplest version of deploying a Django project to a server requires a lot of steps, a lot of dependencies, a lot of work. Can we just cut through all of that and make the problem go away? What is the most direct route to having a working Django application live on the internet for you to use? And it's probably a third-party service. It's a platform as a service, like Heroku or OpenShift, or Heroku's the only one that I'm vaguely familiar with. I haven't had the opportunity to use these very much. But the trade-off for using them is actually one of the easiest things that you can assess. They provide a particularly special peace of mind. They generally provide you with that one and only one obvious way to do it. Heroku, for example, provides detailed instructions on deploying your app. And they've dictated the answers to most of the deployment decisions you might otherwise have been faced with. If you are using Heroku, then you will use a virtualenv during your development. That's just one of the things that they say you will do. And Heroku will install your pip dependencies during your deployment step using the Heroku toolchain, I think. You will use a WHISky application server like Green Unicorn or uWHISky. That's just the way Heroku expects your app to be executed. You are encouraged to use environment variables for all your tunable configuration settings, and I think you're required to for the ones that Heroku needs to be able to configure, like the database URL and stuff like that. And you'll serve static files using some piece of WHISky middleware like white noise, instead of using your own web server or your own Nginx or your own Apache. So Heroku, I'm using Heroku as an example just because it's probably the most well-known, but most of them have similar rules. Most of them end up giving you will do it this way if you want your Python running on our servers. So if you're going to make this decision, your deployment becomes a lot simpler. You basically just follow the instructions. It costs money. It might be quite a lot of money depending on your website. Heroku scales pretty well, but it gets expensive once you start having a lot of infrastructure up there. And it's somebody else's computer, as in the cloud. The term is, remember, cloud just means somebody else's computer. And it may be that ceding the control of your site or infrastructure is not something you're prepared to do in your organization. Or you may have data sovereignty or privacy considerations that basically just mean a platform as a service isn't even an option. So usually this is one of the ones that you can go, oh, actually, this is a good fit. We'll just do it this way. But often it's just as quick as, oh, I'd love to use Heroku, but actually it's just not an option for what I'm doing. OK. So you're going to have your own infrastructure then. You're not using platform as a service. You're going to run your own servers. Maybe they're Ubuntu or Debian or Red Hat or whatever. What is the simplest thing that you can do there? Can you use distribution packages for everything? Can you just go apt-get install Django? Sorry, apt-get install Python Django in Debian? You better not. No current, to take Ubuntu as an example, no current long-term support version of Ubuntu. So the ones that are current right now are 12.04 and 14.04. 10.4 is dead, right? Yeah, it might as well be. But those two versions, they come packaged with, or in their package repositories, they come with Django 1.6 and they come with Django 1.3, both of which have fallen out of upstream support. So they are no longer being supported by the Django team, which means that the Debian or Ubuntu teams have to support them themselves. And frankly, they probably aren't. In Ubuntu, Django lives in the universe set of packages, which has a looser security update policy than main. It relies on community updates. And if the community has moved on, as the Django main development team has, it's just not actually a safe option. Other distributions might vary. Like the latest Debian, is it called Jessie? Do I have that right? OK, the latest Debian comes with Django 1.7. And Django 1.7 is currently supported by the Django team, but it's not a long-term support release. So Django 1.7 will no longer be supported while Jessie still is being supported. And you can rely on getting security updates and stuff like that from the Debian team for that, but I don't think it's a good idea. I think you're going to need to handle your own dependencies from pip. You're going to end up needing the Python package index. So what about the application server platform that you're going to go with? This is a decision between using Apache with ModWhisky or using a web server like Apache or Nginx, reverse proxying requests to a dedicated WHISky application server, such as Green Unicorn or uWHISky. I'm getting better at that. I'm getting better at pronouncing it. So on using Apache 2 or ModWhisky, if you're using Apache anyway, because it's your platform of choice, then there's really no reason not to use ModWhisky. It's pretty reasonable. It's fine enough. It's certainly stable. Sorry. Using ModWhisky couples your application code directly to your web server. The default configuration even runs the app in the same process as the web server and as the same user. Graham, I think I've still got that right? Yeah. So in my experience, I no longer think this is a good idea at all. For more details on that, come to my talk on security architecture on Sunday. But my suggestions are, These days, my suggestions are don't use ModWhisky. And that's mainly because I'm a very firm believer in keeping the web server absolutely separate from the application server. They, in a perfect world, would be on different machines. So if you use a ModWhisky server, if you use a WSGI application server like Green Unicorn or uWhisky, then you can use whichever web server you like better, because it's no longer coupled to the web server at all. It's basically just the web server as a proxy and serving the static files. If you do use ModWhisky, and it is a perfectly reasonable choice to make if for other reasons you want to make it, then one thing that you absolutely should do is put in the extra configuration to run the WSGI server as a different user from the web server itself. What is the command called? It's daemon process something or other? Daemon mode, yeah. So you run it in daemon mode where you get to choose a different user to run your WSGI, your Whiskey app, and then you make sure that that user doesn't own any files on the system, and you have you get as good security separation as you can. No privileges at all. That's always a better thing. Okay, let's talk about getting your files into the right place. Whose answer to this is usually just use Fabric? Nothing wrong with that, but the problem is that Fabric is actually just a shell script, right? Like that's like saying use bash. It's basically just a language in its own right. It doesn't solve the problem for you, it's just a useful tool for running those commands. There's a million ways to do this. You could use rsync, you could use Fabric, you could just straight up SCP, you can tarball it, you can build a Debian package. I'll talk about that briefly near the end. The exact mechanism doesn't actually matter, but I want to give you one really important guideline that you really have to keep at the forefront. So what matters is knowing exactly which files you sent. The one thing that you don't ever want is you can't do a deployment from your working copy, from your repo, and discover that some extra file that happened to be in your repository or some changed Python file that you hadn't committed ended up in your deployment. Who's had that happen? Yeah, it totally does. That's a thing that you really never ever want because it completely blows away the repeatability and predictability that I was talking about earlier. So whatever tool you use, your starting point has always got to be a clean repo. It's always got to be a clean checkout from a known tag or a release thing or something identified by a commit hash so that you really do have as close as possible a way of pinning down exactly what you're deploying. Git archive is the tool of choice for this starting point. You use git archive and it'll just make a zip file of your repository at a certain commit. And then from there, your scripts or tools that you use ought to be working on that. And that way you always know, oh, I deployed commit hash A, E, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. There's a lot of scope there, but the key point is just make sure you know exactly where your code was at when you did the deployment. So what about getting your configuration in place? When we talk about configuration, we're talking about the environment-specific settings. We're talking about the secret key should always be different between environments. It shouldn't be the same on your dev environment or your staging environment or your pre-prod or your production. Your secret key needs to be something else. Your database passwords, if you're using, are hopefully different passwords for each environment. Maybe some of them have debug mode turned on. Maybe some of them have debug mode turned off. You usually don't want these settings in your repository. Like if you're doing the traditional Django development tricks, you'll probably have a local settings.py, and then you'll probably have an extra step or something in your git ignore to make sure that that doesn't get committed to your repo. And then, like I was saying before, one reason you want to keep this stuff separate is you want to be able to change these settings without having to do a full deployment every time. So there's two options here that have become reasonably mainstream. The first one is the one that's basically recommended in the Django tutorials and in the Django documentation, where you use a local settings.py, and that has maybe from settings import star or something where you grab all your regular settings and then you override things like turn debug on or off and set your database settings and stuff like that. Another option, having all configurable settings as environment variables. And then in your settings file, the database password might be os.environ.get db password or something. So that's the 12-factor app recommendation, that sort of setting come through in environment variables. And then you can do something weird. You can just add a little bit of extra code to your settings file that reads an additional file for configuration. This is really easy because you've got Python's config parser module, which is really nice for just grabbing a set of configuration files. You can have a default one, and then maybe an etc, one in etc, which is for your overall settings. So I've never been happy with using local settings. I've never been happy with local settings being configured in a Python file. The Python really ought to be static, unchanging program code. If it's configuration stuff, you don't actually want it to be Python code that can monkey patch a function somewhere in a view. I hope none of your developers will do that to you, but that shouldn't be an option. And environment variables are a perfectly workable one, but you might end up with a whole bunch of environment variables. This .ini thing is something that I've actually done in all my major projects, and it works really well in the situations that my projects have been deployed in, where they usually consist of developer teams handing over the packages to an operations team. And this way, the operations team gets given a thing that they then install, and then they have a configuration file which can have comments in it and documentation about here's where you put the database settings, here's where you put whatever else. And maybe that configuration file is being handled by some sort of orchestration system like Puppet. So it's been a little bit of extra overhead, but this is actually a really feasible solution depending on your project. And if you're in a much more DevOps situation where you are the developer and the deployer, maybe it's overkill, but it's actually worked really well for me. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the weirder things that I've done in my adventures in Django deployment. Can you turn your Django project straight up into a Python package that you then install using pip? Has anyone done this? Whew. See, this is the thing. Like, I've ended up doing some weird stuff, and I don't really know how weird I'm being. And it's a relief to me that only about 5 or 6 hands went up, which means that I am satisfactorily weird. We are the outliers in weird solution management.
I went further and made a whole RPM and repo for it. So.
I'll get to that. So the answer is yes, but it's a little bit tricky. So why would you want to do this, first of all? Because then, sorry, I'm getting some. Because if you turn your Django project into a .whl or a Python package, then your virtual environment becomes your whole deployment. Once you've done virtualenv my project, pip install my dependencies, pip install my project, and then you run collect static, you're finished. So it reduces quite a lot the files you have floating around, because otherwise you might have your project sitting in one place. You have to add that to the Python path, but then you also have to make sure that you're running your virtual environment from some other directory. So as long as you use application-level static files and application-level templates directories, then this becomes pretty easy to write a Python setup.py that will install your Django project inside a VM. And then you can either turn manage.py into an entry point script, which I'll show you a brief example of, or just eliminate it and use Django admin.py for all of your command line needs, as long as you have that environment, the Django settings model environment variable set. So the setup.py ends up looking really straightforward, because this is just find the packages in your subdirectory and install them. And then the only weird thing is you set up a console entry point for your manage.py surrogate. And that would end up looking just like something like this, where you've just taken the content of manage.py, turned it into a function, and then, just going back to that one, this means that you end up having, when you do the install, this ends up meaning that you have a binary, like a script called my project, and when you run my project, it just does the same thing as Django admin. And so again, this has been a really powerful tool for me where I need to basically document the use of my project to people who aren't me, who are the ones with pagers. So making their lives simple is absolutely my top priority because I don't want to get paged. You have to remember a couple little things when you decide to go down this road, though, because when you're building your wheel file, when you're building your package, it doesn't by default include all of the data files and stuff that you might have otherwise needed. And what's frustrating is if you do it in developer mode, it just kind of adds a link to the working copy, so it looks like it's working until you build your package and deploy it, and then it's missing all of its templates and all of its static files. So you end up doing a little bit of fiddling. So can you go all out and just Debianize or use an operating system package for your entire project? Can you put its virtualenv and its static files and its dependencies all in one single, I'm just going to use Debian as an example because this is where I did have to go down this road, one for seamless instant development to the server without having to use pip during deployment? You can, but also it's a little bit fiddly. So the reason this was a nightmare when I decided to try and wrangle this is virtualenvs, you need to build them where they're going to go. You need to build them in the directory that they're going to live in, and you can't move them. Anyone who's tried to use the relocatable option in virtualenv, it doesn't work. And it's not even included in the Python 3 built-in virtualenv because it's just not really feasible. So I wanted to be able to build a Debian package that had the virtualenv in it. My goal was to make sure that you never need to download your dependencies from the server that you're deploying it to. I wanted to leave the Python package index out of the whole deployment mechanism. So to do that, building the package means installing all the dependencies during the build process, zipping it all up into a Debian package, and deploying it. I ended up using an old tool called PBuilder for this, and I'm not going to go through this in detail today, but I really ought to turn it into a talk or turn it into an automated script because this would be quite a useful thing to just have a way of building a virtual environment and putting it in a package. PBuilder is an old school Debian tool for package building. It builds Debian packages in a ch-rooted environment with a fresh Debian install for every time you build the package. So the advantage of that is that you know that you've got your build dependencies right because the build will fail if you're missing Python dev or missing any of the dependencies that you might need. But the other advantage of it is it just throws away that working copy of the ch-rooted environment when you're done. So it doesn't matter if your build process spams files into weird places during your install. So I can install my virtualenv into opt my project or wherever I want to put it, and then as part of the build process, move that into the target directory that gets zipped up by Debian. This is actually an extraordinarily powerful tool for Debian-based server infrastructure because it basically means that the deployment of your project is more or less instant, even for all of the dependencies and all of the virtualenv building. And you also have all of those files under the operating system's package management, so rolling it back is as simple as installing the previous version. Uninstalling it is just apt-get remove the package. It was a bit of a fiddly mess to go through, but it was definitely worth it for me. So I'm going to close up, and I'm going to open up for questions and a bit of discussion shortly. But I had one final thought, which is, does Docker solve all these problems? Does Docker solve every problem? Is Docker magic? Hands up if Docker is magic. Who thinks that Docker is the absolute solution to all of this? Not many people. It actually, I hate to say it, but it kind of solves a lot of the problems. A lot of the stuff that I was talking about, Docker really does. it forces you into a very 12-factor model of doing things, which is actually still quite useful. And it gives you that separate build stage and deploy stage that is what all of my wrangling with Debian packages is all about, where during the build stage of your Docker image, you'll build your virtual environment, you'll install all your dependencies, you'll get everything set up, and then that all gets zipped up and turned into a Docker image. And then the deployment is just the launch of the Docker container with that image. And that's a very good goal to have. But it buys you into a whole set of new problems, because now you have Docker. And I grudgingly think Docker is really, really cool, because now that I've finally had a chance to play with it, I started working with it a month ago, and then I was ranting to my colleagues going, damn it, this is actually really cool. But I don't think it's the present yet. I think Docker is still a little bit young. I'm happy to stand here and tell you that this is the future, but I'm not sure if it's the present yet. So this is a quote that I first got from Russell, sitting down there. And it's actually one that's really stuck with me, especially. So it was not coined by Russell. It was coined by, this is one that I'm not sure about pronunciation, Masig. But it's a really good rule to have. Production needs to be boring. Production needs to be predictable. Production needs to be safe. And if you're excited to use a technology, you probably don't want to use it in production. Using Django actually does still excite me. I really like Django. So I make an exception in its case. Thank you very much for listening. So I actually would like to contradict what Russell said at the end of the last talk about people coming up and saying, this is my opinion rather than a question. I am very much interested in hearing people's opinions and hearing about where they've done things differently and where they think I'm wrong. But keep them to the 20-second level or something so that we can get some more opinions up.
Okay, so just this once, you get a free pass. Just to get us started with an actual question, though.
Sure.
Amber made the point earlier today that Django is opinionated, and the reason it's opinionated and it's okay to be opinionated is because 80% of people just want to get their blog up, and their requirements are really boring, really easy, and Django suits those requirements. Is there an 80% solution for deployment? I mean, most people who come to Django aren't DevOps people, don't want to be DevOps people, they just want to get their blog up, or maybe a slightly more advanced site where they want to have, yes, database replication, they want to have a bit of load balancing and some redundancy, but they don't really want to dig into all of this, and most of them have relatively simple and common requirements. Is this even an achievable goal to have take these config files, just use those and put your source code there and it will run and be fine. And then you can tweak it, but that works. Is that an achievable goal?
I think the 2 scoops template project gets you kind of close to that. I don't actually have a copy of the latest edition, so I haven't read through that. But when I read the 2 scoops book, I was very pleased to see that most of it didn't disagree with what I had found out after years of trying. I think that the quick and dirty 80% solution that would be really nice would be use a simple WSGI thing like Green Unicorn, use white noise for serving the static files so that it's just a part of that same thing, throw that online somewhere reasonably safe. Like, I almost want there to be a Heroku-type model for doing your own deployments. And the reason that's tricky is just because Heroku have done a lot of work on their side to do the process management and all of that other stuff. So if there was some easy alternative to go, set it up the same way you would for a Heroku project and then run it on your own server with this little thing. And there's a piece of software, I think there are projects that are trying to do that, but I don't know anything about them. So I'm not sure if there is an 80% solution that you can just point people at. Maybe the 2 scoops template project is a good place to start.
All right, so.
Amber.
Hello. Question about Debian-based deployments.
Sure.
If your Debian package is the entire virtualenv and all its dependencies, so that obviously means that you can't have a generic Debian package that just sort of works if you have C extensions.
That's right. So in Debian terminology, you're talking about a binary package. Yeah. You're not talking about a source package that would then be compilable in every place. So you build a binary package, and it has dependencies for that operating system. It has, this requires Python 3 and Python 3 dev. This requires a few, whatever other dependencies you need. Mm-hmm. So you use Debian to distribute a binary package containing a virtualenv. And that, because yeah, most of the time you do end up with some C extensions. Like PsychoPG2 comes with C extensions. So.
And when you have a project, say you have a project and you have expansions to it, so say you have some custom plugins for that, if it's in a virtual environment, how do you extend the virtual environment in that Debian package? Is that something that is wise to do, or is it where you just throw it away and you don't go down that line of deployment?
Optional plugins for your...
So for example, as an example, like you know how VirtualBox has their OSE extensions? Something like that for a Python, where you have an open source project that has proprietary add-ons that sort of add on top of it rather than come bundled. Is it you just bundle it with the whole thing? So you'd
probably bundle it, because that's very much a solution for the Debian packaging one is a solution for, it's actually a controlled environment. You're launching your own website to your own website infrastructure. Mm-hmm. It's not a general purpose solution. Like it's not this is now an open source website that it is. If you're going down that road, it's because you already know what platform you are launching to. You wouldn't go down that road and then open source it for someone else to launch it on Heroku, right? You would actually, it's because you've set the rules of your deployment environment. Cool. So that would mean that optional plugins are things that you've already chosen and would be bundled in.
Thanks.
Docker, hoo-hoo. Yeah, so I'm taking the 20 seconds to say how we're doing it. Because I have found, like, I've been doing the Docker thing for the last few months as well, and built our whole system up to, you know, a dev can spin up basically identical to production, you know, which we found really useful. But what we're doing is the build phase, we've gone and you don't install the whole Django app, for instance, in your image, but the image puts a lot of stuff in there, but it's got a kind of a bootstrapping script and process that it goes through. So you spin it up quickly, and the first time it goes and gets all the pip things, it gets to your repo and stuff via Git archive, and then installs it in the right place. You can mount that on a volume-only container so that the second time you do it, it's really quick if you're in development. But I just thought I'd share a bit of that, because that's
I would like to talk to you in more detail after, because my latest project, we are using Docker.
Yeah.
And it's still very much in development stages, which is why I can say things like, I'm not sure how I would solve the Docker problem for production yet.
Yeah.
But maybe you can help me learn. So let's catch up.
Yeah, look, perfect.
Cool. Graham.
Yeah, more opinion from me.
Yes, please.
Possibly part benefit for you, but also for the other people, since we were discussing it earlier.
Yeah.
So on the ModWhisky front, I do have a new project called ModWhisky Express. It means you can pip install ModWhisky. You can even pip install Apache if you don't have a working Apache on your box. I have a project in play which has a whole structured build and deploy hook mechanism, so that you can have your app set up once and you can deploy to Docker, OpenShift, and Heroku using ModWhisky and Apache, although Heroku is Python free only, or on your own box.
Yeah, so what you're describing is essentially a mechanism for turning ModWhisky into an execution model like Green Unicorn and uWhisky.
Yes.
And so that solves my only concern that I have with using ModWhisky these days, which is I want my app server on a different box. So that's something that's definitely worth investigating.
And for those people who are scared of Apache, the whole point of ModWhisky Express is it generates the Apache config for you. You don't even have to look at the Apache config.
Thank you.
Any tip about Windows?
Sorry? Okay,
I don't mean generally speaking. I mean for Django deployments.
I think we're out of time. The answer to your question is that's one road that I have not had to go down. So I simply can't really give you advice on that, except for a major project that I was working on, they were saying, oh, we might want this to be deployed on Windows, even though it was designed to be an Ubuntu deployment. And we basically decided that if they really forced that decision, we would just hand them virtual image appliances to run on Windows on VMware. so that doesn't help, I'm sorry.
I'll tell you just our use case, because it's quite common actually. We have to take screenshots, and they don't render anywhere well, or on Linux generally, they don't render well in web browsers. But they do on Windows, they're okay. And on Mac, you can't do much with servers and Macs and things very easily. So we have to run Windows and we have to deploy code onto it.
Yeah,
and
interesting.
It sucks.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run your web application on the Windows
we don't.
stack.
We mostly don't.
Yeah.
But some people might have to deploy code on Windows from time to time. So I was just wondering, generally speaking, if you...
I'd love to learn more, but that's not where my expertise is, no.
Hi. My question is about Django settings file. So I'm relatively new, 3 to 4 years of working with Django. So first we were using local file and one setting file. Local file was overwriting in the development environment. Then we moved on to 2 scoops model, one file for local, one for testing, one for production. But that has its own pitfalls. So now we're using a mix of 2 scoops and variables, environment variables, right? So, but we're still facing some problems. So if we have to run the Django management command in the production environment, we have to do some things. We have to actually run it from our local environment, overriding the setting files with the actual values in the production environment. Otherwise, so what's your take on this? What's the best way to do that?
I'm not sure that I like the idea of having to do both. I would definitely settle for one or the other. In terms of if you're going to use environment variables for your configuration, you should probably use environment variables for all your configuration. Okay. But maybe that's as simple as an environment variable that says this is a dev environment equals true, and then that could configure a bunch of settings for you. That could, in the settings file, you can, because it is Python code, you could have an if statement in there saying if this environment variable, then set this and this and this and this. No, I'd have to talk to you a bit more afterwards to get a handle on your situation.
All right, thank you.
So my 20-second comment.
Yeah.
There's a package called PEX that I've come across, which is apparently what it does. It packages your package and all of its dependencies into a zip file. Then it prepends onto that zip file a shebang that points to Python and then a Python bootstrap script, and apparently this works. So yeah, I saw that and I thought it might be a good way of getting the sort of here's a thing that you can deploy that's one file like Docker, but without Docker.
A former colleague of mine also built a tool which I think he called Wheelbarrow, and it does something like you configure a JSON file, you run it, it'll pull down all the dependencies and throw them as wheels into a zip file, and then you can use that to build the virtualenv out of that zip file. And that's a solution that I did something similar for with a previous project where I had a Debian package that didn't have the fully built virtualenv, but it did install into a directory all of the wheels and a script to install the virtualenv. And that was a pretty good solution, except it took a while to run the install because it still has to build the virtual environment once you're there. And I had to deal with a whole lot of annoying problems with Ubuntu Precise's pip was using like the old version of setup tools, and I couldn't use the virtualenv to install pip, so I had to use the get pip script to install pip, and then use the pip to install the new pip, and then get the zip file with all the wheels to be installed by that pip. And that's why I was much happier when I discovered a way of building the virtual environment and then packaging it.
Thanks for the great talk. Just one comment on the wheel thing. That's something, for example, Sentry does when you install it locally. They have a project where that includes all the Django projects or project files, and I think they have a settings file, settings ini file, where you just configure it. So it's not too crazy at all.
Cool.
Okay, it's time. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.